just to let you know that this session is being recorded. If you do not wish your image to be captured, please would you switch off your camera. What happens later is that this recording is distributed via our YouTube and other networks for people to view potentially globally. So if you'd like to maintain some of your privacy, please turn off your camera. Otherwise, you'll be captured and distributed with the rest of the session. We don't normally record question and answer sessions. There's an unseen British Society of Criminology document which says we shouldn't do that, but it's like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lots of people talk about it, but nobody's ever seen it. But this session is being recorded with special dispensation today, because otherwise, without it's mainly question and answer. So without you know, a recording, we wouldn't be able to distribute much of the content at all. This afternoon, and welcome, we've got Professor Mark Walters with us from the University of Sussex. Completely uninterestingly, the University of Sussex was the first campus I ever visited, and I had a beer in the East Slope Bar. I don't even know if it's still there. Now, Mark is with us today as an admirable and highly esteemed professor involved in hate crime and the law, and I think nobody would argue with the point that Mark is the expert when it comes to hate crime legislation in the UK. So we're very glad we've got him with us. We thank him for his time. Mark's going to run through an update of the legislative position in the UK regarding hate crime, first of all, and then after that we will invite your questions, please. Your questions could be on your research journey, writing up your proposal, writing up your research. From members of the public, you might be asking questions about hate crime legislation. You might be asking questions about the future of hate crime legislation. Also, if you're a student or a researcher, you might be asking about methodology, about approaches to research, or about the law itself. So there's quite an open range of stuff that you might want to ask, and as soon as Mark's finished his session, we'd ask you to ask those questions by raising your hand, and then we'll take those questions in the order that they're presented. So you'll be grateful to hear that I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Mark with, once again, my thanks for joining us this afternoon. This is a series of talks where we've had some cracking speakers, and Leah should take full credit for instigating this series in the first place, though I've been doing it for 3 years too. So Mark, good afternoon to you. Mark joins us from Sussex, probably. Just a little bit about Mark. His original law degree came from Sussex. Then there was another one from New South Wales in Australia, which is quite a commute. And then latterly his other master's studies and doctoral studies took place in Oxford. We're very grateful for you to being with us today, Mark. Over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Leah, for inviting me to join you all today. It's my pleasure to be here. First things first, East Slope Bar has closed. It was the first bar that I went to as a student, and many fun memories there, but yeah, with redevelopment it's gone, unfortunately. But okay, I digress. So hate crime legislation, what I'm going to do over the next about 15 minutes is just it's not working, there we go, just to sketch out what the current legislative framework for hate crime is in England and Wales, and to provide some information, some data on how many cases are reported to the police, how many are prosecuted, how many cases result in conviction, and then how many of those cases result in the hate crime provisions being applied in practice. Yeah. And we'll be able to see the difference between the number that are recorded and the number where hate crime laws have been applied, and you would therefore get what I refer to as the justice gap for hate crime. And I'll then go through, and I won't do this in detail. You can ask me questions at the end if you have any particular points that you want to ask me about, but I'll go through some of the problems with the current legal framework based on my research over the last 5 to 10 years on this. And also then look at what the proposals for reform are. And finally, whether those proposals are going to be put into effect anytime soon. All right, so firstly then, the current framework of laws are split into three main pieces of legislation. And as you'll see, they are quite fragmented in nature and hierarchical in the way in which they operate. So the first piece of legislation, perhaps arguably the most important, is the Crime and Disorder Act 1998. And that creates what we refer to as 11 substantive offences. Those are hate crime offences, but in law, they are termed aggravated offences. So racially and religiously aggravated offences. And they cover things such as assaults, but property damage, as well as harassment, stalking, and a number of other public order offences. And what they do is that they relabel criminal offences and they provide the words racial or religious and then aggravation into the title of the offence. And then they increase the sentencing maxima. So, for example, racially aggravated assault is a criminal offence that someone can be prosecuted with an enhanced sentence compared with the basic offence of assault. And I'll show you what the difference is in sentence maximum in just a moment. So that's the first piece of legislation. The other most important piece of law is the Sentencing Act 2020, Section 66, and that replaced the Criminal Justice Act 2003, Sections 145 and 146, where these provisions were originally. And that allows sentencers, so judges, magistrates, to increase someone's penalty if there's evidence of hostility based on one or more of 5 protected characteristics. And I'm sure we all know what those are: race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity, as it's termed in the law. The difference between the Crime and Disorder Act and the Sentencing Act is that the Sentencing Act does not create new aggravated offences. Yeah. So it's not a part of the criminal law. These are sentencing provisions that operate at the very end of the criminal process post-conviction. So they don't relabel offences. And what they don't do, which the Crime and Disorder Act does, is they don't elevate the sentencing maxima for the base offence. And I'll show you what I mean by that if you're not sure in just a moment. And then finally, we have the Public Order Act 1986, Parts 3 and 3A. And these parts prescribe a number of different, mostly speech acts. So words that are spoken, which are intended to, or which recklessly, depending on what type of speech we're looking at, stir up hatred. And there are 3 grounds here: race, religion, and sexual orientation. So you can see already that the legislation's kind of appearing in various different parts of the law, and that they each cover slightly different protected characteristics. Yeah, so it's fragmented and, one could argue, also hierarchical. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the purpose of hate crime laws really are to enhance sentencing. So if we take, for example, racially aggravated assault under the Crime and Disorder Act, that has a sentence maximum of 2 years. Now, if you were prosecuted for sexual orientation hostility based assault, so you would just be prosecuted with assault, then the maximum is 6 months. And that's because the sentencing provisions apply, and sentencing provisions cannot increase the sentencing maxima for a criminal offence. That has to be in the criminal law. Okay, so you can see also a racially motivated assault can attract 4 times the sentence maxima than a homophobic assault. So we might say that, why is that? Is that fair? Okay, so how often is the law applied in practice? And we can get an estimation of that by looking at various different data points. Yeah, and this provides us with what I referred to earlier as the justice gap. Yeah, that's the number of cases which enter the system but do not result in conviction and a sentence uplift. All right. So based on 2023 statistics data, that's the last point where you can get each of the data points. You'll see that there were 145,000 hate crimes recorded by the police, which resulted in just over 12,000 prosecutions, just over 10,000 convictions, and then just over 8,000 of those had a sentence uplift. Yeah, that meant that either the crime disorder provisions were applied or the Sentencing Act, Section 66 was applied. Yeah, and the judge announced, I'm increasing the sentence because of hostility. Well, that means that about 94% of recorded hate crimes, only recorded, so the number's going to be much, much bigger if we look at unrecorded, but 94% do not result in the direct application of hate crime legislation. Just a note of caution, those data points are very, very slightly different, and they use very, very slightly different definitions of hate crime as well when you get to the court stage compared to the investigation stage. So we have to treat these data with a little bit of caution, but it gives us an approximation and a pretty reasonable one, I would say. Okay, so why is that? Why is there this justice gap? There are lots and lots of different reasons, of course, and I'm not going to go through the institutional or the cultural reasons, but I'm going to pinpoint some of the barriers, as I would label them, which appear in the actual law itself, which might mean that the law isn't working as effectively as it might do. All right, so the first thing to mention, which I've already covered, is that the law's fragmented. Yeah, so it appears in different parts of the law, different statutes, and that can be a little confusing. Okay, and what my research found in 2017 was that the sentencing provisions aren't applied as consistently as the Crime and Disorder Act provisions are, because sometimes the hate element gets filtered out of the system, it gets lost, because it doesn't form part of the criminal offence that needs to be proved in court. So the collation of evidence of hostility isn't high or high enough on the priority list for the police, because they don't have to collate evidence to prove the offence in court. Yeah, so that means sometimes that the hate element drops out of the system. As I've also already mentioned, there is that disparity. Then why is it that race and religion is protected in the criminal law, but other types of hate crimes, such as homophobic or biphobic or transphobic or disableist, is covered in sentencing provisions only? So why is there that disparity in level of protection? Now, I've not gone through the legislation itself because of time, but the key word that's used in our legislation is hostility, yeah? Racial hostility, sexual orientation hostility, transgender hostility, yeah? And what we found is that that word and its meaning, which is interpreted and applied by the trier of fact, mostly jurors, is more narrowly conceptualized or understood than other terms such as prejudice or bias, which are used in hate crime laws in other countries around the world. So we might want to look at, well, why don't we use words like prejudice or bias or contempt as words that might better fit some types of hate crime and allow a more successful prosecution rate, especially with regards to disability hate crime? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. The other point to mention is that there are two different legal models when we look at hate crime laws: the animus model and the group selection model. The animus model includes a word within the statute that reflects hatred or prejudice or bias. So, as I've just mentioned, in England and Wales, that's hostility. That's the animus that's added into the legislation. Other countries use what's called a by reason test, which is where an offence is a hate crime if you select the victim by reason of their protected characteristic. Yeah? And as some of you might know, I'm an advocate of that model, but it's not used in this country. And I can explain perhaps later why that is and what my thoughts are on that, if anyone's interested. And then finally, we might ask, well, does the current framework protect all of the groups that are marginalized, that are commonly targeted in this country? There's only 5 protected characteristics. But what about age? What about gender identity? What about gender and sex? What about subcultural groups? Why are they not protected? Okay, so have I run out of time already?
No, you're fine. No, you're fine, Mark. Sorry, I was
That's okay.
The button was stuck. No, that's fine. Please continue.
All right, I've only got 2 more slides. So there was a Law Commission review of hate crime legislation a few years ago. There was actually one in 2013-14, and nothing happened with that. And so they did it again in 2019 to 2021. And they come up with a number of recommendations. It was a huge piece of work, over 200 pages, the final report. And I worked with the Law Commission quite intensively during that period. And they came up with a number of recommendations. The first is that the Crime and Disorder Act should be expanded to cover all of the 5 protected characteristics. Yeah, so you don't get that disparity between, for example, homophobic assault and racist assault. Yeah, it would be treated the same in law and at sentencing. Okay, so to create parity across the law. They also, very interestingly, actually, provided criteria for inclusion for protected characteristics. And this was a big piece of work. And they set that criteria out in 3 main points. Yeah. So the first one was demonstrable need, i.e. how prevalent is it? Then the second criterion was additional harm. Does this type of offence create additional harm to victims and communities and to society? And then their final criterion was suitability. Is it suitable for us to include it in the law, or might there be other factors or other rights, such as freedom of expression, that need to be considered and which might then mean that it ought not to be included in the law? They, interestingly, concluded that gender should not be included. In fact, they looked at all of these other characteristics, age, subcultural groups, and they used the criteria and they said, look, there's not enough evidence that it fulfills these 3 criteria. And so we're not going to expand hate crime legislation in this country at this stage. And that included gender. They argued that's to maintain consistency and clarity in what groups are protected. And it's also based on this principle called minimal criminalisation. That means that the criminal law really, really should only be used as a last resort. We shouldn't just go there first of all. There's a problem in society, criminalise it. But is there a real need for us to invoke the criminal law? And they said there isn't for these other characteristics. But they did say that it should be included, gender and sex, that is, under the Public Order Act. So that's the stirring up of hatred offences. So what they're saying is that for the Crime and Disorder Act, no to gender, but for the Public Order Act, the stirring up of hatred offences, yes, it should. And I think that's a little bit confusing. In terms of the legal test, I did say to them, look, hostility is too narrow and it's not always working that well for certain types of hate crime, especially disability hate crime. And they therefore recommended that we expand the test to include prejudice, so hostility or prejudice. And the hope there really is that if you demonstrate prejudice or you're motivated by prejudice, that might be broader in its understanding amongst jurors and the courts than someone who's motivated by hostility towards someone's protected characteristic. Yeah, so it might include things like acting on a stereotype or acting on a bias or a mild dislike of someone because of their characteristic rather than, intense aggressive hostility towards it. Okay, whether that will help or not, I think maybe a little, but I would still prefer a different model to be used. That model, I would argue, should be a group selection model, but they felt that was overly inclusive, that it would include offences that may be based on stereotypes, but that don't really reflect someone's prejudice to a degree that they should be called a hate crime offender. All right, so it would be overly inclusive and it would capture too many offences as hate crime offences, and they didn't want that, partly because of the principle of minimal criminalisation. And finally, they recommended that all of this should be in one act, a hate crime act. Yeah, so all of the crime disorder provisions, all of the Public Order Act provisions, one piece of legislation to stop the confusion, apart from the sentencing provisions, which remain in the Sentencing Act. So we would still have two separate pieces of legislation. I don't know why they didn't say, let's just include everything under one act, but there you go. Okay, so those are the proposals. What's next? The Labour government in their manifesto committed to creating parity across the characteristics for the CDA, the Crime Disorder Act. But they've also since mentioned that misogyny or sex and gender should be protected as well. So we might see that be included at some point in the future. When will that be? Well, my insider, I'm not going to name any names, but someone who I called earlier to get an update said, look, there's no timescale, there's no consultation, there's actually no minister that has formally committed to take on the portfolio of hate crime. There's not even a re-emergence of the hate crime action plan or strategy that the Tory government got rid of in 2020. And that may be a result of their fear that the Conservative Party will react quite loudly to them criminalising hate crime, identity politics, misogyny, etc., etc., and that they don't want that backlash in certain newspapers. So there might be an element of caution, or I would argue, being overly cautious for fear of a political backlash. So that's it. That's an overview. Happy to take questions on either what I've talked about here or anything else in terms of hate crime research that David mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Mark, very much. It's been an interesting political journey and an interesting legal journey. And thank you for encapsulating that for us. I've put a picture of Mark's book around legislation and hate crime in the chat if you would like to look at that. And of course, you can look at the title and order a copy if you wish. Interestingly, Mark, as you were saying there, because of the political changes that parties are aware of, there is some doubt at the moment as to whether the Labour government, the new government, will look at hate crime again. But also they've got, depending on whose statistics you believe, there is the Reform Party snapping at their heels, so that might dissuade them from carrying out some action at the moment. But anyway, I'm talking too much again. It's something I do often. But let's encourage your questions, please. So if you have any questions for Mark, please put your electronic hand up. And we will answer, put those questions to Mark in the order that they come in at. And there are already two. So let's move on to Jane, please. You've got the first question.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Mark. Thank you.
Hi, Jane.
Do you know, I'm really enjoying this and thinking about, I love a refresher on the law because it slips in one ear and out the other. But I get a lot of updates from government, you know, the little updates that they send you. Every time someone mentions when are we getting our hate crime law, we have some, as you say, we have some politicians saying the government is committed to introducing the new legislation and we'll let you know as and when. But the other thing that comes up a lot is, in my view, Tory politicians talking about non-crime hate incidents. And you didn't mention that, probably for brevity today, but I just wondered what your view was on whether we would see a change in that.
Well, interestingly, I spoke to someone in government earlier on that topic. So you're lucky. I didn't mention it because I wanted to focus on hate crime law, and it kind of falls just outside, although it's of course indirectly linked. So as we know, the new code from the Home Office that was published a couple of years back now is a total mess. Oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? Okay, is lacking in clarity and is therefore very, very difficult to apply in practice. You can still record a hate incident, but there are only very, very limited circumstances in which you can record the details of the person who's been accused, or the victim's details, yeah, for freedom of expression reasons and human rights reasons that were articulated by the judgment in the case of Miller. It's not working. It's caused a lot of confusion. There's so many criteria that the police have to look at in order to record a hate incident, that it's acting as a real deterrent. And we know that that can have disastrous effects, right? Consequences where individuals who experience long-term ongoing forms of antisocial behavior can have a devastating impact on their lives. We know that from the Pilkington case, of course, and various other cases. And it doesn't allow the police to collate intelligence and to see where sort of hotspots of hate and hostility are arising. So in my view, it was not a good move. It had a lot of political motivation behind it from various different sectors. But a certain individual within the police by the name of Paul Giannessi has been tasked with reviewing that. And so he's currently reviewing the strategy for investigating and recording non-crime hate incidents. There may be a perception, not relating that perception to any individual, let's say me, that is an attempt to kick it into the long grass rather than just sort it out now. So it's kind of this long-term ongoing review of what the strategy should be, rather than saying, let's sort it out and let's change it, and these are the reasons why. So I think it's going to continue for some time that hate incidents won't be recorded, or won't be recorded in a way in which they used to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of thinking changed around the recording of hate incidents after the Home Secretary's speech of October a few years ago, when Priti Patel was the Home Secretary, and she talked about the waste of time, the waste of police time that was being used on focusing on hate incidents. Most regrettable moment in politics. Mia, your question's next.
Yeah, I've heard Professor Neil Chakraborty from University of Leicester say how a lot of hate crime, we don't know like some of the extent of the hate crime that goes on because of how hard it is to report. And I found it particularly hard to report my hate experiences of hate crime, because I've been subjected to a very long hate campaign online for trying to argue for reasonable adjustments to airport security. And I had a lot of abuse online, and it's been, I've started writing a book on my experiences and using actual screenshots of the online abuse, which I still have dating back 15 years. And I'm only just doing it now because it's taken that long for anyone to take me seriously, because for many years, a lot of people made it all about my mental health, suggesting that CBT and positive thinking was the solution, sort of thing. And I'm an abuse victim, so so it's like a lot of these things around reporting are a lot scarier. But yeah, I think a lot of it is that there's no support for victims. And I think a lot of people also would say to me, if you didn't post controversial stuff online, meaning the issues I was affected by, then it wouldn't happen. So it's like, it is hard for a lot of victims to come forward. So I think that is a lot of the reason why people don't know the extent of it. And also, I'm autistic, and I think for a lot of neurodiverse people, reporting is hard because a lot of us don't understand the processes, and then we often get signposted to numerous different places. So it can be harder for autistic people to understand exactly what the processes are.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your experiences. Of course, they are far too common across the country, and I would suggest are growing in number in terms of especially online abuse. I've myself been a victim of hate crime, and I have also witnessed hate crimes, and I've tried to report those to the police on 3 occasions. One when I was the victim and I phoned 999 and it was engaged. And then I phoned again and it was still engaged. And I didn't know that that could happen. I didn't know that 999 could be engaged. But by the time that the police phoned me back, I was like really upset and crying. So yeah, that, and obviously the perpetrator at that point then absconded. They did afterwards then come to my house and you know, make a report and stuff. And it was a very nice gentleman who did that. The second time was in Sussex a few years ago, and I witnessed what I believed, as a professor of criminal law, a public order offence, which was anti-Semitic. And there was a police officer there, and I reported it to him, and he said, "No, it's not." And I said, "Well, I think it is." And I said, "The reason I think it is because this is what the law is." And he said, "Oh no, you've misinterpreted the law." And I said, "Well, you know, it's really difficult to not sound like a total idiot." But I was like, "Well, I'm a professor of criminal law and I specialize in this area." And he said, "Are you threatening me?" And I said, "No, I'm telling you that I'm a professor of criminal law and that this is my area of research." And he then like puffed his chest up and came towards me like this and basically threatened me for trying to report a hate crime. So I then said, "Look, can I at least report it as a hate incident because you are required?" And he said, "No, there's no point." And that was that. So, you know, this is a white cisgender man who's a professor of criminal law in my hometown, unable to report hate crime. So, you know, it's really difficult for others. And then finally, I reported what I believe to be a hate crime online and just never heard anything back. So, yeah, there are clearly significant barriers, cultural, institutional. There is a lot of people that don't even report. You know, the Crime Survey for England and Wales estimates about 180,000. I would say that is a serious underestimation for a number of reasons. But the issues that we face are increasing. It's getting more difficult, and I think a part of that has been the political actions of the previous government and then the inaction of this one to change that. That said, we probably should also note that we do record more hate crimes in this country than any other country in the world. I've not recently done the calculations, but I'm pretty sure that we record more hate crimes in this country than all of Europe put together. So we've got problems, and there are barriers, and there's a lack of access, but we also do a hell of a lot better than most other countries as well. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep fighting to improve that system and increase awareness and access.
Thank you, Mark. We've got a question from Lee I'll come to in a second. And if the audience has got any more questions they'd like to consider now and put their electronic hands up, then we'll take those in a moment. Your research perhaps, or from the public sector about hate crime legislation, about reporting, about methodology and research, all kinds of questions we can answer here. Interestingly, you talk about reporting hate crimes, Mark. I've helped over 100 victims now over the years. And I was once told by a police officer that we know your type. Well, that's that's very interesting because my wife's been trying to work out my type for near 40 years. So I was hoping they'd have a more solid answer than that. But
well, hopefully she likes your type if it's been 40 years, to be fair.
Well, if we ever speak, I'll know. Leah, your question, please.
Thank you. Just to echo Jane as well, it's always really good to get that refresher of legislation. It's criminal law is definitely not my background, and so it is something that I appreciate having just explained to me repeatedly, just to make sure that I do understand. My question was, you mentioned the group selection model, and that's something that you I think would propose as being more effective. Could you say a little bit more about that? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an advocate of the animus model through the demonstration test. So that is what we have at the moment as part 1 of our two-part test, or it's not two-part test. There are two ways in which a hate crime can be committed. So I advocate that because I think it's really important if someone demonstrates hostility during the commission of an offence, that should be classified as a hate crime. And we're one of the only countries in the world that does that. And that's one of the reasons why we prosecute and record more hate crime in this country than other countries, by the way. But I think instead of having a motivation test, which is the second part of the legislation, i.e. that you're motivated by hostility, we should have a group selection model. And the reason for that is that proving someone's hateful motive is really hard in court. It's really difficult to evidence. It's really difficult to get into someone's head and go, well, what was your purpose? What was your reason? Okay, it can be evidenced by, looking at their past behavior, WhatsApp messages, material that they've been reading, protests that they've been going to, etc., etc. So it can be evidence. It's really hard. And what the research suggests around the world now, in Canada, the US, across Europe, my research is that the motivation test is just really rarely applied, because when it is applied, it's not successful. So a lot of prosecutors just don't want to do it because they're like, well, the jury's not going to accept it because we don't have enough evidence yet. So there's a real barrier in terms of applying hate crime legislation in court. I think the group selection model also has limitations. I'm not saying it's going to be the perfect solution. You'd still have to prove that someone selected a victim because of their identity. Yeah? So you're still going to have to say, well, why did you do it? But you don't have to prove that they had a hateful motive. Okay, you could just say, look, here is circumstantial evidence. So here are the facts. It's clear that they were selected at least substantially because of their identity characteristic. Yeah. And so an example would be where two perpetrators go on to Grindr, which is a dating stroke hookup app for gay men and transgender people in the main, and bisexual people as well, and pansexual people. And if you go on there and just target gay men and then rob them when they come round, then that would not necessarily be evidence of a hateful motive towards gay people, but it's evidence that you've targeted them because you see them as vulnerable, as an easy target, as perhaps based on your stereotypes of gay people. And I think those cases should be classified as hate crimes because you're targeting a marginalized group who are vulnerable because of their identity. Yeah, perhaps you're not the most hateful person in the world, but you are still doing something that discriminates against that person and that group and makes them more vulnerable, makes them more marginalized in society. And we should recognize that in law. Now, most other academics and legislators disagree with me in that analysis, but that's outlined in my book fully as well, because I think it reflects a broader process of marginalization that should be reflected in the law. I'm hoping that's semi-clear. It's really hard to get your head around all the different models and the tests. It takes ages for it to filter through and to properly comprehend how it works in practice. It did for me, it took me years, so I know that it's not necessarily, oh yeah, that makes sense. It takes a little while.
Thank you. That's really reassuring.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, one thing, this is probably a good time to mention that our next presentation on March the 19th, we listened to Inspector James Bird from West Midlands Police, who's got a new model of pastoral care when dealing with victims of hate offences from all 5 protected groups. And James will be with us to tell us about his new model of how he looks after victims and how they progress crimes, hate crimes and hate incidents. So we look forward with interest to seeing what James has to offer. Rachel's got a question. If you don't mind, I'll come to that in a moment, please. And so does Jane. And I was just about to mention you, Jane, because we listened to a presentation recently in this series whereby a researcher from Edinburgh, Napier, indicated the differences in reporting now of different hate crime classifications between Scotland and England since the change in legislation in Scotland. Could you just briefly outline that change in legislation in Scotland for us, Mark? Why it's different from England and Wales? And at the time, we remember there was a great kerfuffle in the right-wing press about how awful it was. Perhaps you could just say a few words about that before we press speedily on to our other questions.
Okay, so the two main changes, they've extended the characteristics beyond what we have in this country. So there are more characteristics that can be included. So if you've got more characteristics, then obviously there are going to be higher numbers recorded, potentially. I don't know the numbers at the moment off the top of my head. But they haven't included gender or sex there, but that's under review. But they have included age. Yeah. So that's one factor. The other factor is that their stirring up of hatred offences have a slightly different test to ours. It's a little broader, and that caused a lot of contestation amongst mostly gender critical feminist groups spearheaded by people like J.K. Rowling. And the concern was that because it's slightly broader, I need to look at the specific wording, but they use like a reasonable person test, which we don't use in our legislation, to determine whether something is considered to be threatening or abusive. And there's a little bit more scope for interpretation as to what that might include. And the fear was that if you were to say, I think that trans women are men, that might be included within the ambit of the legislation. I've written about this, and I'd say I really don't think it would be. And for all of these reasons, I'm pretty certain it wouldn't be. But nonetheless, it may have led to an increase in reports, and then I think a rejection of a lot of those reports. So there was concern amongst certain groups, such as gender critical feminist groups, that lots of people would be classified as hate crime offenders or people that have committed hate incidents. But I think the actuality of that is that it hasn't. That's my understanding, but I haven't looked at the data or done research in Scotland for a while.
Thank you, Mark. Rachel.
You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry, my headphones die sometimes. Thank you so much for your presentation and the answers so far. This might be a bit of a pessimistic question, but we'll give it a go. Obviously, a lot of us were working in hate crime research. You yourself have been working with the legislation for years. Where do you think it's going to go? You know, sometimes I feel like it's quite stagnated. You have people saying that they're going to push the legislation forward and it never does. It's very outdated. We have online safety legislation that didn't really take into consideration hate crime in the way that many of us hoped for. So yeah, I guess as someone who really, you know, has the skin in the game and really is aware of what's going on, what do you think is going to happen in, say, the next 5-10 years? Do you think we're going to get the changes that we need?
So I think I do share your pessimism. I think we have to try and remain hopeful as people working in this sector, because otherwise you can get really disheartened and it's really hard. Yeah, you know, one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is our emotional well-being as researchers in this area, by the way, because I think it can be really challenging. But we are at a really precarious point in history, and I don't say that in, you know, as hyperbole. I think we are really entering what has been labelled as an era of hate, and we can see that especially at the moment in the United States and parts of Europe. And there clearly is an increase in the number of hate crimes, hate incidents, and hate speech online. You know, that I think that's undeniable, that there's been a significant increase, and that is directly linked to politics and to political rhetoric and to the growing support for anti-establishment governments. Of course, there's a big argument around it's just a different type of establishment and it's all you know, it's all been calculated. But we can see it with our own government, with immigration and asylum seekers, yeah, you know, ramping up the rhetoric, the fact that they're not doing anything about hate crime. So I think that, I don't know, I'm not, you know, I'm not that wise. I don't know what's going to happen. But I do think that we're in a tricky period, and I'm fearful of it. I'm hopeful that there are enough voices in government that will say, look, this is in our manifesto, we have to make these changes and we have to push this forward. And behind the scenes, I know that people in government who are saying, look, are we going to do this? They're like, yes, we're definitely going to do it. We're definitely going to do it. But then nothing happens. And I think that's because at the top, it's like, don't do anything, don't rock the boat at the moment. Well, let's bide our time until the right moment. And I suppose we won't know whether the right moment will come or not. That's my fear. I think that politicians on the left have to be bolder, and they must start re-articulating the values of equality and inclusion and multiculturalism, because at the moment they're sort of stuck, frustrated and frightened to speak, and that's not going to help anyone.
Thank you, Rachel and Mark. And if I can amplify this skepticism, because last year I was about 7 months, I was the recipient of death threats and some also awful stuff about the work I do. I used to work in national security, so death threats are not new to me. But I suppose I should be grateful for the standard of assassins in this country, that they never really get to me. But yes, and it's interesting that people like Facebook have just disbanded their fact-finding teams. You know, they were never that robust in the first place, and the procedures for looking after clientele in social media platforms are never that good. But that now one more thing has gone. Jane, my apologies for leaving you hanging on. It's your turn.
No problem at all. Thank you. Last question from me was thinking about the proposals by the Law Commission for the change in law. If, let's be positive here, if we do get a piece of legislation come through, are we going to see an improvement in conviction rates as a result? Is there a risk that having a sort of a set increased offence, if you will, for all strands might result in fewer convictions, based on some of the research that's been done on juries and how they tend to be less likely to convict anyway, compared to, say, increased sentencing?
So I would argue that no, I think that there'll be an improvement, but I do share some of your skepticism in that what we often see is if when you push forward with something, you then get a jolt back.
Yeah.
But then after the jolt back, you get a much bigger leap forward, right? So you see that often with same-sex marriage, so equal marriage, at the time or just after, there's like a big increase in homophobic violence. But then a couple of years later, the levels of support for same-sex marriage and acceptance of it really leaps high. There's quite a lot of research on that in the US, for example. So I think it might be the same in that sense. I think that there will be more cases prosecuted as hate crimes as a result, and there'll be less filtering out of the hate element. You know, I'm always stuck as a researcher between wanting a really effective body of hate crime laws to make sure that groups that are marginalized are protected, that it has a really important symbolic value to communities, and that it really provides the impetus for police forces and other criminal justice agencies to address hate crime as a serious category of offending. And then on top of that, I'm like, well, I don't really like people going to prison for long periods of time. And, you know, so I have this kind of strange juxtaposition between my work on the one hand on criminalization, on the other on restorative justice. Hopefully in my new book I try and bring those two things together in a coherent way. But you know, I do think that we need better criminal law offences to cover hate crime. I do think that will improve conviction rates, and I do think that supporting those laws, there should be a greater emphasis on community resolutions and restorative disposals and so on and so forth, but that's probably less likely to happen. It's not going to be a panacea, because what I haven't discussed today is all of the institutional cultural issues and the political issues. that aren't going to be resolved by changing the law, not in the short term. So while I think there'll be a slight improvement, I don't think it's going to, the justice gap isn't going to disappear because of it.
Gives us a bit of hope, though, for the shop, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think, and what is really important, if you ask all of the groups that are fighting for various different rights, disability rights groups, LGBT rights groups, they really want this change. It's really important to them symbolically. And it's not just about symbolism. You can't change the law just for symbolism, but it's important that you feel protected by the law, because if you're not, you do feel othered, different and unequal. And that's really important.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Mark. I had are there any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have a kind of a standby question. But as my importance here is lesser so than anybody else's, I'd encourage other people to ask a question first. If you'd like to put your electronic hand up.
Yeah, don't be shy. I am happy to answer any type of question. No question is silly, so feel free to ask me anything within reason.
I was discussing with Leah earlier about dog misbehaviour, but perhaps that's a little too wayward. Claire, you're next.
Hi, Claire. You're still on mute as well, yeah.
Not doing well this afternoon, am I? Sorry about that. So I'm meeting my MP tomorrow to talk about actually disability hate crime on public transport. And I'd love to take some of your views on what I should really be asking, getting the Brit to make them do something, because we've asked questions, had the questions go through, but what can I really give him that would really go to make them actually do something?
Well, I think I'll answer part of this question, and then I think David is probably the best person, because this is what he specialises in. He's written a book about it. But
yeah,
from me,
I thought I'd get your opinion as well.
So there's lots of things, but as a lawyer, I would say this. I would say, look, it's completely unacceptable that people who are victims of disability hate crime are treated differently in the criminal law to those who are victims of racist or anti-religious hate crime. What message does that send out to disabled people about how we value them in our society? If you can commit a racially motivated assault and get 2 years in prison, but when you commit that assault because they're disabled, you can only get 6 months. That cannot be acceptable in a society that values equality, dignity and respect. And if you say it to them in those terms, so how is this possible? How are you allowing this to continue? Then I think that will get the message through.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the book, but also, Claire, we've discussed before that reports into the Met Police daren't use the word disableism, yet it does indicate that disabled people are treated differently. But it will mention racism, even though people are treated differently because of their race. There seems to be this reluctance to fully accept that disabled people are getting a raw deal. Yeah, but please, good luck with your meeting with your MP tomorrow.
I'm going to grill him, but you knew that was coming.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, might I suggest an air fryer rather than a grill to save on energy? But yeah,
I sure will.
They're quicker as well. You'll get results quickly.
Easier
Excellent.
to clean.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. My final question then, Mark, we've only got a couple of minutes left, is probably the most difficult one, and I did talk about it earlier, is why in places like Poland are they getting away seemingly with so much anti-disablist and anti-LGBTQ hate crime when there are strong European directives which tell each nation how they should behave? Is it a matter of interpretation of the individual nation that these European directives are not taken up? I know the culture in Poland is different as it is in any nation, in that people become targeted. But why is it there is no enforcement of European legislative systems?
It's a good question. The person to answer that more fully would be Piotr Godzic at Leicester, because he's written extensively on this very topic. The answer is obviously really, complex and, multi-tiered. His work suggests that, the history of that country has very strong roots to Catholicism and social conservatism. And therefore, there's also, on top of that, an older history of a West and East divide in terms of ideology, and that LGBTQ plus people are seen as a bit of a Western kind of disease or concept that's been brought over. It goes against a lot of, traditional interpretations of Catholicism. It is not, really celebrated, diversity of gender or sexual identity amongst social conservatives. And it has been seen as an export. So there is a strong cultural resistance to LGBT plus people because of that. Now, that is changing. Under the last government, you did have a very right-wing president who, made it a point to rally against LGBT people as part of his political rhetoric and he's campaigning. You now have Tusk, who was, is he the president of the European Commission? Who, does have those values, which are pro-LGBT plus people, and they are making changes. The Pride parades are starting again, and there are movements to change the law. So it is a slow process. At the moment, that change is tentatively happening under the current government. But a fuller, more comprehensive answer would be given by Piotr.
Yeah, in fact, I've had conversations with Piotr about this. So yeah, Mark, it just leaves me to say thank you very much. I'm stopping the recording now.